When most people picture a cowboy, they imagine dusty boots, a wide-brimmed hat, maybe a horse standing nearby, and a campfire crackling under the open sky. But there's something most movies never really talk about. What did Mexican cowboys, the vaqueros, actually eat while living and working across the American Southwest? Because the truth is, food wasn't just fuel for them. It was survival. It was comfort. It was culture passed from one generation to the next, carried across deserts, ranches, and long cattle drives. Vaqueros didn't have fancy kitchens or stocked pantries. They ate what they could carry, preserve, hunt, or cook over an open flame. And somehow, from those simple ingredients, they created meals that were filling, flavorful, and deeply connected to the land. Let's step back in time for a moment and sit by the fire with them. One of the most important foods for vaqueros was frijoles, or beans. Beans were cheap, easy to store, and packed with energy. They were often cooked slowly in clay pots or iron kettles, sometimes for hours, until they turned soft and rich. A pot of beans could last several days, reheated again and again, getting better each time. For a cowboy who spent all day riding, herding, and roping cattle, beans were dependable. They never failed you. Right alongside beans came corn tortillas. These weren't store-bought, neatly stacked tortillas. These were handmade, often right at camp. Corn was ground into masa, shaped by hand, and cooked on a hot griddle or flat stone. Tortillas became plates, spoons, and wraps all in one. You could scoop beans with them, wrap meat inside them, or just eat them plain. Simple, warm, and comforting. Meat was another big part of vaquero life, but not in the way we think of today. Beef was common, of course, but fresh meat didn't last long in the heat. That's why carne seca, or dried beef, was so important. Thin strips of meat were salted and dried under the sun. This jerky-like food could last for weeks. It was chewy, salty, and tough, but it kept cowboys alive during long rides with no towns in sight. Sometimes that dried meat would be rehydrated and cooked into machaca. The meat was pounded, shredded, and fried with fat, onions, and peppers when available. It turned something hard and dry into a hearty, flavorful meal. Machaca was proof that vaqueros wasted nothing. Another staple was chili peppers. Fresh, dried, or ground into powder, chiles added heat and flavor to otherwise simple meals. They also helped preserve food and mask the taste of meat that wasn't exactly fresh. More than that, chili was comfort. It reminded vaqueros of home, family, and tradition. Rice also played a role, especially as trade routes expanded. Spanish-style rice, cooked with tomatoes and spices, became a filling side dish. It stretched meals further, making small portions of meat feel bigger. A plate of rice and beans might not sound exciting today, but after a long day in the saddle, it was everything. Vaqueros also relied heavily on lard, or rendered animal fat. Lard was used for cooking, frying, and adding calories to meals. It was essential energy. Without it, food would be bland and bodies would burn out faster. A spoonful of fat could make the difference between strength and exhaustion. Sometimes meals came from the land itself. Wild game like rabbit, quail, deer, or even wild turkey was hunted when cattle weren't available. These animals were cooked over open fires, often roasted or stewed. Nothing fancy. Just meat, salt, fire, and patience. Eggs, when available, were considered a luxury. Huevos con carne, eggs scrambled with leftover meat, was a favorite breakfast when ranch life allowed it. Protein-heavy and filling, it gave cowboys energy for long hours ahead. Cheese also made appearances, especially queso fresco or aged cheeses that could survive travel. Cheese was eaten with tortillas or melted into dishes. It added richness to otherwise rough meals. One food that might surprise people is pan duro, or hard bread. Similar to biscuits or crackers, it was baked to last a long time. It wasn't soft or fluffy. It was tough. Sometimes it had to be soaked in coffee or beans just to chew it. But it didn't spoil easily, which made it valuable. Speaking of coffee, café de olla was common. Coffee brewed with cinnamon and sometimes piloncillo, a type of raw sugar, gave warmth and comfort during cold desert mornings. It wasn't just caffeine. It was ritual. A moment of calm before the day's work began. Sweet foods were rare, but when vaqueros could get them, they mattered. Piloncillo, hardened sugar cane, was carried in chunks. It could be shaved into coffee or eaten in small pieces. It gave quick energy and a taste of sweetness in an otherwise harsh life. Another important food was caldo, or soup. Soups made from bones, leftover meat, vegetables, and spices allowed vaqueros to stretch ingredients. Bone broth provided nutrients and warmth, especially at night when desert temperatures dropped. Corn wasn't just tortillas. Elotes, roasted corn, were eaten when fresh corn was available. Simple, smoky, and satisfying. Corn was life in many ways. Sometimes vaqueros made tamales, especially during celebrations or when families were nearby. Masa filled with meat, wrapped in corn husks, and steamed. Tamales took time, so they weren't everyday food, but they carried deep cultural meaning. Another preserved food was chorizo, a spice sausage that could last longer than fresh meat. When cooked with eggs, beans, or potatoes, it turned simple meals into something special. Potatoes, when accessible, were fried or stewed. Papas con chili became a filling dish that required little meat. Milk, when cows were nearby, was sometimes turned into curds or simple cheeses to prevent spoilage. Fresh milk didn't last long in the heat, so processing it was necessary. Vaqueros also ate nopales, cactus pads, when available. Cooked properly, they provided nutrients and hydration. The desert itself fed those who knew how to listen to it. Flour tortillas eventually joined corn tortillas as wheat became more common. Flour tortillas were softer, richer, and could be cooked directly on hot metal. They were filling and flexible. Sometimes meals were nothing more than beans, tortillas, and coffee. And that was enough. Vaquero life wasn't about abundance. It was about endurance. Leftovers were never thrown away. Yesterday's beans became today's refried beans. Old meat became soup. Food was respected because hunger was always close. What's important to understand is this: vaquero food wasn't poor food. It was smart food. It was designed for survival, movement, and strength. Every ingredient had a purpose. These foods didn't disappear. They became the foundation of Southwestern cuisine. What people eat today in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California owes a huge debt to vaqueros. When you eat a burrito, a taco, or a plate of beans and rice, you're tasting history. You're tasting meals cooked under open skies, eaten beside horses, shared among men who worked hard and rested little. Vaqueros didn't need fancy recipes. They needed food that worked. Food that stayed. Food that kept them alive. And somehow, from dust, fire, and simplicity, they created flavors that still live on today. That's not just food. That's legacy.